At my brother's engagement, Dad stood in the center of the room like a king holding court. Everyone clapped, the champagne sparkled under the chandelier, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally see me. Instead, he pulled out a thick envelope, smiled at my brother, and said, "Our special gift to you." Inside were the apartment papers. The very same apartment I had spent the last 2 years paying $30,000 into. My savings, my sweat, my future. My stomach dropped as if the ground had been ripped out beneath me. Dad clapped my brother on the back, the room erupted in cheers, and then his eyes cut to me like a blade. Cold, dismissive, final. "Pack your things," he said, voice carrying over the crowd. "And get out. Now." Everyone went silent. My champagne glass trembled in my hand. My cheeks burned as 100 eyes pinned me to the spot. No one defended me. Not even my brother. So I left. With nothing but the clothes on my back and the echo of Dad's command ringing in my skull. "My name is Claire Morgan. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been treated like a stranger in your own family?" The cold night air hit me as I stumbled outside, heels clicking against the pavement. The laughter inside carried on without me. My brother's fiancée squealed in delight as she hugged the papers, the very ones that were supposed to be my security. I had no car. No money left after paying bills. No place to sleep that night. Just betrayal pulsing hot in my chest. I walked. Miles, it felt like. Past the glittering shops, past the couples holding hands, past the glowing windows of homes that weren't mine. My phone buzzed with messages from friends asking why I left the party. I ignored them. What could I say? That my own father had thrown me out like trash? By midnight I was on a park bench, the city lights flickering like they were mocking me. I clutched my bag to my chest, tears stinging but anger pushing through every drop. This wasn't just unfair. It was war. Dad thought he could erase me from his story, hand over my sacrifices to my brother, and watch me disappear. But I don't vanish. I burn. And that night, as I sat shivering on that bench, I made myself a promise. They had taken my home, my money, my dignity. I would take something from them that could never be replaced. The kind of revenge that leaves scars deeper than any eviction notice. The engagement party was their celebration. But soon, it would be their undoing. They thought I'd crumble. They thought the scene at the engagement, the envelope, the applause, my humiliation, would bury me. They were wrong. I woke up in a cheap motel off Route 9 with a throbbing head and a folded receipt that smelled like stale coffee. My phone had one unread voicemail from Mom. "He didn't mean it, Claire. Come home." I deleted it without listening. Home had been a place where my name came with a price tag. I had $47 in my bank account and a rent ledger on my phone proving every dollar I'd paid toward that apartment. Proof I thought would matter. Proof was my weapon. But family law isn't poetry. It's paperwork, loopholes, and patience. And patience wasn't a luxury I intended to afford them. I drove back to the building at dawn before anyone else could claim the narrative. The lobby smelled of lemon cleaner and indifference. The janitor glanced up, then away. I showed him the receipts, the transfers, the emails from the landlord that used to be addressed to me. He shrugged like paper was less solid than breath. The management office, predictably, had been persuaded by the shiny new deed and a check from my brother. $5,000? $10,000? Money speaks louder than memory, and theirs had a louder voice. That's when I saw the framed photograph in the leasing office. Dad, beaming, hand on my brother's shoulder, my name nowhere. The silver frame caught the fluorescent light like a blade. My chest went taut like a wire pulled too tight. So I started small. Lawsuits cost money, but humiliation is cheap. I began by unraveling the story they wanted people to believe. I messaged every friend who had attended the engagement with a single line. Asked Dad why he handed the papers to Andrew. Some ignored me. Some were confused. Several responded with a mixture of guilt and curiosity. The rumor seeds sprouted. People love a scandal. Especially when it tastes like family. Then I targeted the ledger of lies. I called the landlord and left a calm, economical voicemail outlining the transfers, the account numbers, the dates. I emailed the bank with screenshots. I filed a complaint with the housing authority. When the first official email landed in my inbox, "We are investigating." The word investigating felt like a small iron fist unclenching. My brother texted like a man who expects mercy. "Claire, this is stupid. Dad wanted to surprise me. Let it go." His punctuation was casual, his cruelty surgical. I replied with nothing but the numbers of the transfers he'd accepted. No pleading. No begging. Just truth arranged like ammunition. The nights grew colder and quieter, but my days buzzed with activity. I met with an attorney who smelled of coffee and righteous anger. She had a name. Marissa, a woman who had learned to bite through men's smirks in courtrooms and win. Her first question was not about money. It was about motive. "Why do you want this back?" I said, "Because it's mine." That answer made the room small and sharp. By week 2, the engagement photos were recirculating online with a new caption. "Did Dad steal his daughter's apartment?" Comments piled like the first stones in a landslide. Friends texted screenshots. Strangers shared it with relish. My face, the girl Dad had tried to erase, returned to the frames, this time as a question mark. I did something else. I found the receipts that proved how much I'd paid into the apartment and stuck them in an envelope, then slid that envelope under my father's door at 4 a.m., the kind of hour when conscience is thin and sleep is porous. I left no note. Just the receipts, a quiet accusation that would wake him to the rustle of truth. When he opened that door the next morning and found paper where his certainty had been, I imagined the way his hands would shake picking up each transaction like an indictment. They had thought they could erase me with applause and an envelope. What they didn't know was that applause can turn into accusation. And a single sheet of paper can become a detonator. The morning after I slid the receipts under his door, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. Dad. I didn't answer. The voicemail was short, clipped, his voice trembling just enough to betray the crack in his armor. "Claire, we need to talk. Don't make this worse." Worse. He said it like I was the storm. Like I hadn't been the one left homeless while my brother kissed his fiancée in the home I built. I saved the voicemail, labeled it evidence number 4, and moved on. By the 3rd week, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were roars echoing through every family group chat, every church gathering, every mutual friend's dinner table. My father's colleagues started asking questions. His golf buddies stopped showing up for tea times. The man who lived on reputation alone was watching his empire chip away, not from lawsuits, not yet, but from shame. And I wasn't even done. I began showing up. Not at their house. No, that would have been too easy. I showed up at the same country club luncheons, the same charity galas, the same polished events where my father liked to parade his version of perfection. I didn't yell. I didn't confront. I simply existed. And every time I left a trail, a whispered reminder to someone at the table, "Do you know who actually paid for that apartment?" The truth dripped, slow and steady, until the entire glass was poisoned. Andrew, my brother, cracked first. He called me late at night, voice sharp with panic. "You're ruining everything. Emily's parents are asking questions. They think we're liars." I let silence hang between us, heavy and cruel, before finally answering, "Maybe you should have thought of that before living in a place you didn't pay for." He hung up. 2 days later, Emily herself found me. She showed up at the coffee shop where I worked part-time, dressed in her pristine ivory coat, eyes glossy with betrayal. She slid into the chair across from me, her diamond ring glinting like a blade. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Did you pay for that apartment?" I leaned back, folded my arms, and let her sit in the silence that followed. Finally, I nodded once. Her face crumbled like porcelain hitting concrete. She whispered, "He swore it was all him. That your dad just helped." I didn't need to say anything else. Her tears were confirmation enough. By the end of the week, I heard through mutual friends that Emily had called off the engagement. Not with a bang, but with the quiet devastation of someone who realized the foundation beneath her was rot. Dad tried damage control. He called family meetings, told them I was unstable, that I was exaggerating, that I was making trouble out of jealousy. But proof is louder than denial. And I had proof. That night, as I watched the city lights flicker outside my motel window, I realized something. Revenge wasn't about destroying them in one strike. It was about dismantling their world one fragile piece at a time. And I was just getting started. They thought Emily walking away would be the final crack. They were wrong. The house of cards had a basement, secrets they'd buried in plain sight, and I was about to flip the light on. I got a job at a title company under a fake name. Not because I enjoyed lying, but because there are rooms in this world where paper becomes truth and signatures become weapons. I learned the rhythm of deeds and disclosures, the quiet hum of scanners and fax machines, the way a clerk's thumb lingers on a file like a benediction. I learned where dust gathers on old contracts and where men hide the numbers that don't look right. My fingers grew steady. My resolve grew vicious. I spent nights cross-referencing transfers, matching deposit slips to dates, tracing the flow of money like a cartographer mapping a wound. The landlord's ledger had a knot, a side account used to funnel checks for maintenance, but the deposits matched the months I'd been wiring $1,200 without fail. There it was, the ghost path of my money redirected. I began to pull threads. Small things at first. A mislabeled invoice here, a swapped signature there. I didn't need to commit crimes. I needed to reveal the crimes already committed. I photocopied the ledger, photographed timestamps, tucked copies into folders labeled Claire Morgan, Audit. I printed them in black and white because truth looks sharper that way. When I'd planted the files in the right place, the desk drawer of the landlord who had been too quick to accept the deed, it felt less like theft and more like returning what had been refused. The next morning, a junior associate found them and, curious, sent them to a colleague who sent them up a chain that ended at an internal compliance officer. Paper, once it moves, cannot be stopped. Meanwhile, Dad's brittle calm started to splinter. He called my mother more often, his voice low, apologetic, the way he'd never sounded to me. His church friends sent tentative messages. At the country club, a few members who had once laughed with him now moved their seats when he approached. Humiliation is a slow, corrosive insect that eats reputations from the inside out. My brother tried to rally. He wrote op-eds of contrition on his private blog, bought flowers for Emily's mother, begged mutual friends for silence. But silence is a favor currency and mine had a higher exchange rate. I was cashing out. Then the board meeting. Dad's name at the top of the agenda like a verdict. The company he'd shepherded for decades called a vote of confidence, a polite term for the electric chair. I didn't attend. I watched the live stream from a diner under a muted neon sign, fork paused over pancakes, my pulse a drumroll. When the chairman announced a resignation accepted, the sound in the diner tasted like victory and copper. But anger tempered with something I hadn't anticipated. Pity. Seeing my father's portrait replaced in the company newsletter by a younger man felt like watching a sunset you'd lit yourself. There's a loneliness to a man who loses everything he thought defined him. For half a breath I wondered if I had become him. Then I remembered the $30,000 wired into a place that was meant to be mine. I remembered the invitation that folded into an eviction. I remembered leaving with nothing but clothes and resolve. At night I pinned the receipts on my motel room wall, a constellation of proof, and traced the route of betrayal with a finger until the paper blurred. Revenge is not always red. Sometimes it's the quiet, precise unspooling of truth until the rope around a liar's neck tightens and he cannot speak above the clatter. I had taken their light. Now I would decide what kind of darkness to leave behind. And in the hush before the next move, I smiled at the map on my wall and felt for the first time almost free. They kept calling it collateral damage. Friends whispered it like a comfort. It's unfortunate, Claire, but families do messy things. Messy. As if theft dressed in a suit and a smile deserved an adjective. As if $30,000 evaporating into somebody else's name was an accident. As if I would accept that. By now the city had a new angle on our family. The scandal that smelled of money and manners. Tabloids skimmed the surface. Headlines that wanted drama without teeth. I wanted truth with fangs. So I went deeper. I found out where Dad kept his trophies. Not the brass ones you hang in an office. The skeleton boxes behind the public veneer. Offshore consultants, shell companies with friendly-sounding names, a maze built to hide favors and funnel reputations into more reputations. Men like him build puzzles so they can step over people when curious eyes come knocking. I learned how to pry open the puzzle without leaving fingerprints. I learned which doors were left unlocked by arrogance. One quiet Thursday, I slipped into a church basement where the charity auction committee met. They were arranging silent bids for art donated by donors who liked the scent of their own generosity. One of the women passed around a booklet with donor names and amounts. My father's name was there. Beneath it, a company name I recognized from a transfer I'd traced months earlier. The sum matched a payment that should have gone into my account the year before I moved in. $15,000. A nice round number tucked into the ledger of virtue. Charity makes hypocrisy taste sweet. I smiled at the woman and asked casually, "Has anyone checked where these donations come from?" She blinked, flattered by the question, and passed me the booklet. I underlined the line for later. I started a quiet campaign of exposure, not to ruin a charity night, but to expose the pattern. Money moved to accessorize a holy image. I contacted a reporter I'd met once at a coffee shop who loved big players getting small. I sent him a redacted file that connected the shell company, the donations, the ledger transfers, and the string of payments that had been siphoned away from my account. No allegation. No name calling. Just facts lined up like knives. The story ran on a Sunday morning that smelled like waffles and regret. It was not a headline that screamed. It was a slow burn, an investigative piece that sat in the morning paper like a lump of coal. The email notifications started pouring in. Donors asking questions, board members demanding audits, and board members who had once nodded at Dad's jokes now scrolling through the article with mouths gone dry. At home, my mother started calling me with small, trembling admissions. "He said it was for taxes," she whispered over the line once. "He said he was protecting us." Protection apparently means handing your daughter's life to your son and telling her to walk away. My brother became frantic. He arranged a meeting with the landlord and the realtor who'd facilitated the deed transfer. They all sat in a sunlit office, hands folded like criminals at a church picnic. I watched the footage later, security cameras, glitchy and impartial, and saw my brother's face go from composure to raw fear over the course of 30 minutes. The landlord fumbled documents. The realtor's smile dropped like makeup melting. Men who thought they could buy silence found themselves negotiating with a truth that cost them reputation. But the best part was watching my father at the charity gala the night the article circulated. He stood at the podium and tried to speak about service and the good a community can do, his voice frayed, his practiced cadence gone. Someone in the crowd cleared their throat loudly. Another person shoved a program to the side with a scowl. The applause when he finished was polite and thin, like the last breath of a dying light. I had not wanted to crush him entirely. I wanted him to feel the thing he'd doled out to me. Exposure, the slow unspooling of a carefully constructed image until there was nothing left to hold. Walking away from that gala, I felt the city at my back and possibility in my pocket. There was still so much to take. Truth, accountability, the home that had been mine. And somewhere between the clipped headlines and the thin applause, I found a kind of hunger I hadn't felt since the night I first left the engagement party. Not for revenge alone, but for restitution that would make repair possible. Not for them, but for me. Retribution is never loud at first. It's a whisper, a ripple, a quiet truth dropped into a pond that men like my father believe is still. By the time they notice the waves, it's already too late. The article was the beginning of the end. But endings need precision. I wanted mine to cut clean. That's when Marissa, my attorney with steel in her veins, called me into her office. She slid a folder across the desk, her nails clicking once against the manila like a gavel. Inside were pages stamped with black ink, each one proof that the deed transfer to my brother was legally defective. Wrong signatures. Missing disclosures. Fraud disguised as family generosity. "Claire," she said, leaning forward, "this is enough to not only void the transfer but drag the landlord and your father into court. But if we go public, it won't just be civil. It'll get criminal." Her eyes searched mine, steady, asking, "Do you want war?" I thought about the motel room that smelled like mildew, about walking past that chandelier-lit engagement party humiliated, about the $30,000 that had been stolen and packaged as a gift to someone else. Yes, I said. I want war. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, phones were buzzing in every corner of my father's life. Board members, neighbors, his pastor, my brother's ex-fiancée, Emily, who posted a cryptic Instagram story of a broken engagement ring and the words, "Some lies are too expensive." My father's silence was louder than any defense. He didn't call me, didn't text. He sent Mom as his messenger, her voice fragile on the line. "Claire, he's not well. He says you're killing him." I nearly laughed. Killing him? Oh. I was resurrecting every truth he buried. If it felt like death, that was only because lies cannot survive daylight. The hearings were scheduled within weeks. My brother showed up in a navy suit 2 sizes too big, the sleeves swallowing his wrists, his face pale. He avoided my eyes. My father didn't avoid mine. He glared, unblinking, the kind of stare men use when they've lost their power but cling to the illusion of control. I didn't flinch. The judge reviewed the filings. Marissa spoke with calm ferocity, her words cutting through the courtroom like piano wire. She laid out the receipts, the bank transfers, the fraudulent deed. She laid out me, the daughter who had paid and been erased. The daughter ordered to pack her things and leave at an engagement party where truth had been dressed up as generosity. The judge's ruling came swift and cold. The deed transfer void. Ownership restored to me. My apartment, my home, mine again. The gasp that tore from my brother's throat was the sound of a man who realized his castle had been built on sand. My father didn't make a sound at all. He just sat there, face gray, as though the walls of his life had finally collapsed in on themselves. But victory, I realized, is a quiet thing. It doesn't roar, it settles. That night, I walked back into the apartment with my own key, the one I had kept on a chain around my neck even when I was homeless, even when I slept on benches. The lock clicked, the door opened, and the silence inside greeted me like a long-lost friend. I stood in the center of the living room, the city lights spilling through the windows, and whispered to no one, "I'm home." But revenge is never complete with one victory. Justice had been handed to me. Now came the part I'd been hungering for since that night under the chandelier. Now came the ruin. They thought the court ruling would be the end. They didn't understand that truth is a contagion. Once it escapes, it seeks every hiding place. Once the deed was returned to me, my name stitched back onto the ownership papers, the rest of their house of cards went airborne. The media smelled blood and came hungry. Reporters I hadn't spoken to in years called with microphone mouths and polite cruelty. "Any comment, Claire?" I gave them nothing but the look of someone who'd learned how to hold silence like a blade. The story widened. Fraudulent transfer, charity irregularities, shell companies, and now questions about fiduciary duty in Dad's boardroom. The board opened an internal investigation. The charity returned donations pending audit. Men who had once smiled at his jokes said things like, "We need to distance ourselves." Translation: he was poison. Andrew's job evaporated faster than he could plead. The company he'd been handpicked for released a statement about ethical concerns and unforeseen conflicts. Overnight, clients who had once lined up for meetings with him stopped answering emails. His LinkedIn filled with condolence messages and quiet shrugs. The house he'd moved into with Emily's excitement went into forbearance. He began receiving calls from collection agencies, not old friends. Dad tried to fight back with the only weapon he'd ever trusted: reputation. He wrote op-eds about redemption, gave a shaky interview about family strife, and attended a televised charity roundtable where his hands trembled over the tablecloth. But the questions were sharp, surgical. Interviews cut to the ledger entries. Camera close-ups are ruthless. They don't let you smile through a lie. Then something worse for him arrived. A criminal referral. The county prosecutor, prodded by a complaint that couldn't be ignored, assigned a grand jury to review the transfers. My attorney warned me, "This will be messy. It will get personal." I wanted messy. I had always wanted it to hurt them in the place where power felt safe. Their names, their legacy, the comfortable circles that had let them step over me. The indictment, when it came, felt surreal. Fraud. Embezzlement. Conspiracy. The words were legal and small, but their weight crashed through our family like a wave. Dad was arraigned under bright courtroom lights, hands shaking as they cuffed him for a photo that would live on the internet forever. For a man who had built his life on being untouchable, being paraded under a flash was a punishment worse than prison. My mother called me and cried not for him but for what our family had become. Her voice was a thin wire. "Do you think he'll be okay?" she asked. I thought about how often I'd wanted him to see me as a daughter, not a ledger line. I said quietly, "I hope he learns the weight of what he did." It was the truest answer I could offer. Andrew called less and less. The last time he texted, it was a string of half apologies and excuses. I didn't know. I thought he was helping us. The words sounded like a child explaining away a broken vase. He had no agency left in the places that mattered. When the board voted to remove Dad permanently, the company issued a press release that described him as having stepped down for personal reasons. It was the phrasing of men who wanted to be polite while burying a corpse. But private messages leaked. Colleagues who had once toasted his successes now sent me screenshots of emails where they confessed they had suspected things for years and chosen to look away. Standing in my living room, the apartment finally warm with the soft hum of the heater I paid for, I watched their world unravel from my window. I felt the old hunger, the raw, righteous ache, but it had changed shape. It wasn't merely revenge now. It was the slow reclamation of a life nearly erased. Outside, the skyline looked the same. Inside, everything had shifted. I had my home. They had their ruin. The night pressed against the glass like an audience waiting to see what the next act would demand. And in the hush, I realized how small mercy looks when you've been made to disappear. Mercy, if I offered it, would have to be something that means something. Not empty words, but a reckoning that leaves a path forward, not just ash. For now, I let them burn and watched how carefully their flames took what they had built. They brought him in like a man who had been waiting for a reckoning his whole life but never expected to see it in cuffs. The courthouse doors looked smaller now, the marble less imposing. I watched from the gallery while the prosecutor read the counts. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, words that used to mean nothing when attached to my father's name. Now they landed like stones. In the months that followed, the process was a slow, surgical unmaking. Depositions. Plea talks. The board disgorged what it could. The charity returned funds. Andrew's creditors circled like vultures. The press ran pieces that parsed every misstep. People I had once considered friends offered thin apologies that arrived hours after their silence had done the damage. But the court did something the tabloids never could. It ordered restitution. Not everything. The money had run through too many hands, but enough to close some of the open wounds. My attorney, Marissa, negotiated a settlement that included the return of my $30,000, a public record of the fraud, and a community fund seeded with a portion of my father's assets to support tenants who had been defrauded by predatory deals. It was ironic and necessary. The man who had used charity as camouflage would now be forced, legally and publicly, to fund the repair of the very thing he'd hollowed out. I stood before the judge the day the restitution order was finalized. Dad sat a few rows behind his lawyer, older, thinner, his suit hanging off him like a memory. He looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw the man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders when I was small. The thought flared and vanished. Nostalgia has no business in a courtroom. He mouthed the words "I'm sorry" when the bailiff turned his back. The apology landed in a room full of consequences and did not change them. I'd never asked for his downfall. I asked for what was mine. Outside the courthouse, the city smelled like cold rain and the taste of something concluded. I walked to the apartment with keys that tasted like iron and victory. The place felt different. Not because it was mine again on paper, but because I had returned to it as someone who had taken back more than a space. I had taken back my name. Rebuilding was quiet work. I painted the bedroom a color that reminded me of an afternoon sky. I bought a coffee table with a chipped corner because perfection felt like the kind of thing that allowed people like him to hide. I paid off small debts, set up that fund, and hired an organizer to help tenants who'd been exploited. Watching other people reclaim what was rightfully theirs felt like unpacking a new kind of justice. There was a day when Mom came to visit. She shuffled into the living room with a cardboard box of old photos. We didn't hug at first. We both had wounds that needed tending. She told me in a voice that had been small for too long, that Dad had asked for forgiveness and that she still loved him. I listened. I told her I forgave her for whatever part she'd played in the silence. She cried then quietly like a woman washing away years of dust. As for Dad, he served the sentence the court deemed fit. He made statements in open court, apologies that were formal and measured. I received no peace from them. But at night sometimes I caught myself forgiving in small increments. Not his crimes but the broken child behind them. Mercy, I learned, is a currency you spend on yourself, not the person who broke you. Years later, at a small community meeting where people I hadn't known when this began thanked me for the fund, a woman took my hand and said, "You gave us our roofs back." Her gratitude carried no headline, only heat. That warmth stayed with me longer than any press cycle ever had. I rebuilt more than an apartment. I rebuilt a life that could hold more than the memory of betrayal. The last thing I wanted was revenge for its own sake. I wanted a life where the weight of what happened would not rule the rest of my days. I set the receipts in a frame and hung them in the hallway, not as trophies, but as a map of where I'd been and how far I'd come. And in the quiet of my own kitchen, watching rain make rivers down the window, I finally felt the story close like a door done right.